Okay, just want to mention, I made a slight update. This is a copy of the medical office model that was posted to give you a sample of how models might look with your homework assignment that you're currently working on, doing the model for the music collection, right? I just made a slight revision here. I showed that the doctor and appointment are also directly related, right? In other words, there is a foreign key for the doctor inside of the appointment entity. This makes sense, I think, because after all, if a patient comes for an appointment and there's no doctor to see, did they really have an appointment? No. So we end up having 3 foreign keys in the appointment, and that's perfectly acceptable. And that's another reason why I decided to throw in, you notice we added the little circle here, indicating that the appointment reason, the one-to-many relationship between it and appointment, is technically, the foreign key is allowed to be null, right? So it's a 1 to 0 or many. In other words, an appointment might not have a specific appointment reason. Now, it's true, we already had an example of a nullable foreign key with the medical trial, that not all patients would be in a medical trial. But I just thought this is a slightly different arrangement because of having 3 foreign keys. So I wanted to give the chance to demonstrate doing that with a nullable. Can anyone think of how else, instead of just making it a nullable, what other way could we get around the fact that there might not be a specific reason for an appointment? Feel free to throw it in the chat, or you are allowed to unmute your microphones. I set up the permissions in this meeting so everyone can chime in. So if you prefer, you can just unmute your mic and say something. So again, the question is, if we didn't want to make the foreign key for appointment reason nullable inside of the appointment entity, how else then would we indicate that an appointment doesn't have a specific reason? I'm going to put it down to people just being shy to put forward an answer. Okay. I mean, obviously, we could just make sure or guarantee that among the actual values to choose from for appointment reasons, we had in something like none specified, right? And then you could pick that out of the list. Then there's always something there you could choose, so you don't have to make the foreign key nullable, right? 6 of one, half dozen the other. So I chose to do it this way. If you, in the real world, sometime you find yourself, it's better to do it the other way, that's perfectly fine as well. Okay, all right, so just wanted to bring you up to date on those little changes that I've made to the model, because this is the one we're actually going to use as we start this week. Yes, we are. We're going to start this week and actually building our medical office example. Okay. All right, so getting back now, we're in week 2. What are we doing? Code first and data migration. So we had a quick look at that with our math example, our first example, but we'll try to go a little bit more in depth this time through. And don't worry, I'll try to take it slow enough to make sure we're explaining everything as we go. We're going to be looking at using naming conventions, data annotations, and the Fluent API to get all of the necessary information in place to fully describe the entities, their properties, and how they all relate to each other with our code first, right? We're focusing on code first approach, okay? A big part of that is how we set up those relationships between our entities. We're going to have a separate discussion about that today as well. And we'll also be talking about SQL Server versus SQLite, okay? And why we're going to be focusing on using SQLite, at least for now, and some of the differences we do need to be aware of, because up to this point in your career, you've been focusing strictly on SQL Server, right? And then we're going to get into our demonstration of our big medical office application as time goes on here, right? So in our 1 hour today, we probably won't even start on the medical office demo. That'll come later in the week. Okay, just a reminder about our homework. Hopefully you're, you've got your 10-part tutorial here, the Getting Started with ASP.NET Core MVC. Hopefully you've made a start on that. It's something I often refer to it as the textbook tutorial. So I don't expect you to hand in the textbook, right? It's not something you're going to complete and hand in, but I encourage you to work your way through it because we will be referring back to it at multiple points throughout the term. And I'll say, hey, remember where you did this in the tutorial? And we'll be counting on you having some experience and knowledge based on completing that as well. right? I just had a note here as well as an optional exercise. When you create your own version of the mass database application, instead of, it's kind of, guys, I've stepped you through the whole thing, and so is Anastasia. So, if you really don't want to build it yourself, that's entirely fine, but you might find it's helpful to practice it in addition. That's entirely up to you. It's totally optional. All right, and of course you have your main assignment that's due, on Friday, the data model assignment. A lot of people I've noticed have already been handing it in. Good for you. Excellent. Oh, sorry, someone has their hand up. Sorry. Nasara, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how far was supposed to get per week?
I'm sorry, I've got my speakers turned on instead of my headset. I didn't quite hear you. Can you say that again?
I was just asking about the tutorial. How far are we supposed to get through it?
Oh, well, you have several weeks to get through that 10-part tutorial. I haven't put a deadline on it in particular, no. So it's just something you don't have too much other assigned homework yet. So I was hoping you'd make a good start on it. But don't feel bad if it even takes a couple of weeks by the time you get through the whole thing. Okay?
When are we going to start referencing it? At what point should we have completed it?
I would say within by the end of week 3, at the very latest, you should have tried to have completed it. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, I'll have to figure out why my my sound isn't going in my headphones. I got to take them off then to hear. Anyway, let me carry on for now. All right, so before I get into the material down here, actually I have a PowerPoint ready that it's linked in, it's available, it's in this reference, but I just want to go through it as a PowerPoint first of all. So let me get that going. SQLite, it takes a bit of discussion to make sure we fully understand why we're using it and exactly how we're going to make the most out of it as well, right? Because there are some differences we do need to be aware of as well. So, what is it, okay? As it says here, this is right from their own website. An in-process library implements a self-contained, serverless, zero configuration, transactional SQL database engine. Whew! Okay, it's a mouthful, right? This is interesting. It's the most widely deployed database in the world. There are over 1 trillion active databases in active use in SQL. You have a cell phone? I guarantee you have SQLite on there, possibly being used by multiple applications, right? So yeah, it is absolutely everywhere these days. It is, as I said here, public domain, free for us to use, even in commercial applications. Even a lot of open source software isn't free to use and make money from it, but SQLite is. So it's a good thing to be aware of because it might come in handy in multiple ways throughout your career, right? Main limitation, right? It doesn't allow concurrent write access. In other words, only one write transaction can be going on at a time. Mind you, it's pretty damn fast, right? So, but it does obviously put a limit on how much of a workload it can carry, right? However, it is surprising how capable it actually is, right? As I say here, generally speaking, right? If you have less than 100,000 hits a day on your website, if it's backed by SQLite, you're going to be fine. Right? So it shows you that, like, none of, with all the projects we've done, with all the real-world clients in the last number of years when we've been using SQLite, we have never run into a problem with it being too busy, okay, even for very busy clients and so on and so forth. So it is a limitation, and you do need to be aware of it, right? This is not going to get you up to a big data type of application, but it is very powerful, totally free, and there's a main reason why we're going to use it, and that's because it's free in Azure, right? So how we use it, okay? Well, we've already kind of looked at this. We just installed the package, right, for the SQLite, okay, as a simple NuGet package. And then once we have it there, we just change whenever we're going to create a DB context and add it to our services. We specify we're going to use SQLite instead of using SQL Server, right? We kind of went through that even with our first mask demo. Okay. Now we do have to provide a connection string, and as we showed you once already, they're very, very simple connection strings. Now this screenshot here in my PowerPoint is showing two separate connection strings, right? The idea is our default connection, we're normally, well, it's initially set up to use that for our identity or security system, right? Usernames, passwords, the whole login business. So sometimes we would keep that in a separate actual database from all of our production data, right? So you might set up two separate ones, but you know what? As often as not, we find it works just okay, just as well, and in fact, some ways better to have it all together. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I might as well mention that the only real reason why I would ever go to separate them and keep them in a separate database is if you're going to have multiple applications sharing a common login system, right? Then you would keep the separate database, the separate connection string and everything else to work with the identity system from your actual separate production databases, right? If you have multiple applications sharing a common login. Okay, so you can just comment out the ones or remove the ones for SQL Server. I was just commenting them out so that you can go back to them later on if we're going to play around with SQL Server again before the end of the term. Well, we're almost there, okay? Just a bit of extra work is required sometimes, especially in terms of timestamps for concurrency control, because that's one of the things about sqLite you need to be aware of. We can work around this, but it is not a built-in capability the same way it is in SQL Server. In SQL Server, you can have a row version or timestamp field, and it automatically just generates new values at every time there's an insert or an update, right? And we don't even have to think about it. It just happens by SQL Server itself. Well, that doesn't work the same way with sqLite, right? So we'll talk more about how we work around that coming up shortly. Okay. And of course, we might not be able to add a new migration after the first one. We even saw that in that first little demo we did. Yeah, we could maybe add a new field, make a few changes, and then create a series of migrations that could be, moved forward through them or back through them again. But you often get to the point fairly quickly where, no, we can't make any more design changes to our overall model and keep on with the same set of migrations. But you know what? It's really not a big deal. We just go back, we start a new set of fresh migrations, and away we go. Okay, so that's the end of that little PowerPoint discussion, but I did want to just go through that with you. I'll just point out, I'm not going to read it all because you can read. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and belittle anyone's ability here, but I do have some additional notes in this section here and some references. You can click on data type migration issues here with SQL Server, or sqLite, I should say. So this goes in a bit more detail about some of the things, some of the data types that don't work quite the same way or at all, and why you might do some different approaches here and so on and so forth, right? Okay. All right, so there's a good reference for you on that for the details, but I've kind of summarized some of the main points you do need to know, okay? I talk a bit more about the timestamp, so I might as well discuss this with you a little bit, right? So the row version or timestamp idea doesn't exist as a data type in sqLite. What we normally use is a blob. Now, you've heard of blobs, right? A binary large object, okay? It's a field that we can use to hold basically like a timestamp value. Okay, but it's not maintained automatically by the system. There are, in my link here in this reference, you'll find, oh, sorry, I guess I was here already. You'll find, where is it here? Right, this documentation about database generated concurrency tokens. There's another documentation where it talks about some approaches. Okay, feel free to look at that, but it's not quite the same as the approach I'm going to teach you in class, right? So maybe don't get too hairy on that, because having too much knowledge when you're first learning about different alternative approaches can be confusing. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to supply triggers. Yes, for one reason, I like to use triggers because it gives us a chance to tie back to something you learned last term, right? And see the value of triggers. And sqLite does support triggers, and so that's what we're going to do, is we'll make a trigger to generate our new blob, our new timestamp value every time there's an insert or an update. And then all the other built-in configuration for concurrency that Entity Framework supports will work fine. As long as that's being updated by our trigger, everything else works exactly the same way as it would have worked if we had the luxury of using SQL Server and having the timestamp updated automatically, right? Just some note there, you'll see about decimal in 64, some other documentation there. Very rarely do we actually need the high precision of a decimal. So you'll find that in most of my code, I'll just go to a double. You can actually have a double in the database and decimal as the data type of your property. And that's another thing you can do. You can make that work as well. Again, limitation of migrations. We've talked about it. We've seen it. I'm not going to beat that to death. But just maybe I'll point this out. Just because we run into that brick wall more often with SQLite, where we have to start the set of migrations over again, that does happen with SQL Server as well, right? Even with SQL Server, there are times when our migrations, whether it's our fault or not, sometimes there's a reason why we just can't keep on going forward with new migrations, right? Sometimes we messed it up. Sometimes the system just can't handle some changes are too dramatic, right? So don't lose any blood, sweat, or tears about the fact that we sometimes have to start migrations over. In fact, it used to be, they've improved it quite a bit. It used to be with SQLite, there was never hardly any hope of carrying on with a series of migrations. You pretty much always had to start right over every single time, right? But now it's gotten better than it used to be. So feel free to try it until you hit that brick wall. But don't feel bad then when you do need to just delete the migration, delete the database, and start over again. Okay. So bottom line, which to use, SQLite or SQL Server? Well, in this course, we're going to use SQLite virtually all of the time, right? Because one of the things that you're really going to benefit from as we go through this course is getting used to using Azure, publishing your application live out there to the internet where everyone in the world can come if they have the link. You can even try to get it up in some search engines if you really want to, right? And then that's going to really be important next term because almost certainly you want to be able to deploy your application out to the internet while you're working on an application for a real world client, right? So yeah, it doesn't cost anything to have it up in Azure, whereas SQL Server does. And now, mind you, your free student account in Azure does give you a dollar figure that you can use, right? Within a year, you have so much, like it's $100 USD that you can spend on different things inside of Azure. But the problem is, if you're using SQL Server, very soon you'll burn up all that credit, that $100 credit. And in subsequent courses, a little bit in term 4, and especially if you're going on to term 6, there are features in Azure which are not totally free, and you must have some credit left over in order to actually complete some of the things you're required to do for our courses here at the college, right? So no, we don't want to take any chance on using up any of your credits in Azure. So that's why we're always going to be using SQLite in this term whenever we publish to Azure, for sure. Okay. All right. So that's basically all I have to, that's a link to my PowerPoint that we just watched as well. So that's all I really have to say about SQLite for now. Anyone have any questions about that or anything aspect about it? Feel free to put them up in the chat window. I'll keep an eye on that as well. Okay, so our next PowerPoint here is basically talking. Now, we're not going to go through the whole PowerPoint because I eventually, inside the PowerPoint, we cover all the different kinds of relationships. But we're starting off simple. And, truth is, even I would get lost going right to the end. So we're going to actually do this a bit at a time. But I might stop and start my recording just to break it up a little bit.